January 3 ARD, 1961, Idaho. Inside a silent steel dome, three men are about to make a 20-inch mistake that would change physics forever. They thought the SL-1 reactor was a promise of the future, but at 9:01 p.m., that promise turned into a tomb. In a fraction of a second, the reactor didn't just fail. It exploded with such force, it pinned a man to the ceiling. This isn't just a story about a nuclear malfunction. It's the clinical autopsy of America's first fatal atomic disaster. By 1961, the U.S. military was obsessed with the atom. They didn't just want power plants. They wanted portable batteries that could power a base in the freezing Arctic for years without a single drop of oil. The SL-1 was the answer. It was designed to be soldier-proof, simple, rugged, and easy to run. But that simplicity was a death trap. Most reactors have dozens of control rods to keep the nuclear reaction in check. The SL-1 had only 5. Even worse, the reactor had an Achilles heel, a single central rod that held back the bulk of the power. If that one rod was pulled out just a few inches too far, the reactor would go prompt critical. In plain English, it would turn into a bomb. The men working that night in the Idaho desert weren't nuclear physicists. They were soldiers who had grown comfortable around a captive star. They trusted the blueprints. They trusted the machine. They didn't realize that in this game of mathematical margins, there was zero room for a human mistake. To understand why the SL-1 died, you have to look at the single rod flaw. Most reactors have a safety net of dozens of control rods, but the SL-1 was built for simplicity. It had only 5. The engineers made a bet that cost 3 lives. They designed the core so that one single rod number 9, controlled almost everything. If you pulled that rod out just 16 inches, the reactor would wake up. If you pulled it 20 inches, it became a bomb. But the machine was falling apart. Inside the core, the metal was corroding into what the engineers called meatballs, gritty chunks of junk that made the rods stick. It was like trying to drive a car with sand in the gearbox. 40 times into years, those rods had jammed. And here's the terrifying part. There was no computer to lift those rods. There was just a manual T-bar handle. To reset the machine, a soldier had to stand directly over the reactor, grab that handle, and pull with his own strength. The Army wanted a soldier-proof machine. Instead, they built a hair trigger that required a human to stand on top of a captive star and hope it didn't stick. January 3rd, 9:00 p.m. The temperature outside is 10 degrees below zero. Inside the steel dome, 3 men, Richard Legg, John Burns, and Richard McKinley, are finishing a boring, blue-collar chore. They've done this dozens of times. All they have to do is lift the control rods a few inches to reconnect them to the motors. They are standing directly on top of the reactor vessel. No shielding, no lead glass, just a few feet of water between their boots and the uranium core. John Burns grabs the T-bar for rod number 9. It's the big one. He knows it's supposed to be lifted only 4 inches, but the rod is stubborn. It's sticking because of that internal corrosion, those meatballs we talked about. Imagine the scene. It's cold, it's quiet, and you're frustrated. You give the handle a hard, sudden tug to break it loose. You only meant to move it an inch, but the rod doesn't move an inch. It slides out 20. And in that millisecond, the laws of nature stop being suggestions. 9:01 p.m. John Burns gives the handle a desperate, two-handed heave. The rod breaks free of the corrosion, but it doesn't stop at 4 inches. It flies up 20. In that millisecond, the chain of error snaps. There is no alarm. There is no warning. There is only a blinding flash of blue light. This is Cherenkov radiation. It's the soundless scream of a nuclear core going prompt critical. In less than a second, the energy output of the reactor jumps from 0 to nearly 20,000 megawatts. The water inside the vessel flashes into steam so violently that it creates a water hammer, a massive column of water slams into the lid of the reactor with the force of a freight train. The entire 13-ton reactor doesn't just fail, it jumps. The vessel is launched 9 feet into the air, striking the ceiling of the dome before slamming back down into the floor. Inside, the 3 men aren't just hit by radiation. They are hit by a physical shockwave that no human body can survive. In 4 milliseconds, the SL-1 turned from a power plant into a cannon. When the rod hit that 20-inch mark, the power didn't just climb, it exploded. The reactor spiked to 20 billion watts. To put that in perspective, for one tiny fraction of a second, this one small room was producing more power than a dozen Hoover dams combined. The heat was so instant that the water inside didn't just boil, it flashed. A wall of steam slammed into the reactor lid with the force of a freight train. This 13-ton steel vessel bolted to the ground, was ripped from the floor and launched 9 feet into the air. For the men standing on top, the physics were merciless. Leg and burns were hit by a wave of radiation so thick it was like walking into a solid wall. But for Richard McKinley, the end was even more gruesome. As the reactor lunged toward the ceiling, one of the heavy steel shield plugs was ejected like a bullet. It tore through him, pinning him to the ceiling above the reactor. Then, silence. No fire, no smoke. Just the invisible, lethal glow of a core that had just exhaled its entire soul in a heartbeat. At 9:10 p.m., firefighters arrived at a building that looked perfectly normal. There was no smoke, no fire, just a deep, deceptive silence. But the moment they stepped inside, their Geiger counters didn't just beep, they hit the maximum and stayed there. They weren't walking into a building, they were walking into a microwave. The scene inside was a nightmare frozen in time. They found 2 men on the floor, but it took minutes to find the third. When a flashlight beam finally hit the ceiling, they found Richard McKinley still pinned to the rafters by the steel plug. The recovery was a suicide mission in 60-second bursts. Teams of men in heavy lead suits would sprint into the room, move a body just a few feet, and scream for the next team to take over before they absorbed a lethal dose of radiation. The horror didn't end when the bodies were out. The men were so radioactive that their own wedding rings had been activated. The gold on their fingers was now emitting its own deadly energy. In the end, these men couldn't be buried like soldiers. They had to be placed in lead-lined coffins and encased in concrete human beings treated as high-level nuclear waste. The SL-1 didn't just fail that night. It proved that when we try to make a machine soldier-proof, we often forget the one thing the blueprints can't account for: the terrifying, unpredictable power of a human mistake. The military didn't want the SL-1 to be a monument. They wanted it to be an embarrassment. In the months after the blast, they literally erased the site, tearing down the building, sectioning the reactor, and burying the entire thing in a massive trench in the Idaho desert. But the most clinical part of the cleanup wasn't the soil, it was the story. To protect the future of nuclear power, the official investigators did something cruel. They blamed the dead. They leaked stories of marital affairs and mental instability, trying to frame the disaster as a murder-suicide rather than admit the machine was a death trap. They chose to believe in a madman because they couldn't afford to admit to bad design. But the physics don't lie. The SL-1 failed because it was built on a foundation of overconfidence and cut corners. It serves as a grim reminder: when we try to harness the power of a star, the universe doesn't care about our rank, our ambition, or our excuses. Today, Administrative Area 4 is just a quiet, gravel-covered mound. There is no sound but the Idaho wind. But beneath that dirt, the SL-1 remains a scar on the earth that won't fully heal for 10,000 years.